If I had to describe the feeling the Kingsfield series gave me after playing 1 through 4, it's that it filled a hole in my life that I didn't even know was there. When it comes to slow-paced, first-person, real-time dungeon crawlers, your pickings are, well, pretty slim. And there's a real dearth of options when it comes to the particular kind of experience that Kingsfield offers. And all the games you could consider directly adjacent were made by the same developer 20 or more years ago. Usually when I think of a first-person dungeon crawler, they're party-based and will take the form of a blobber. Even some real-time ones like Eye of the Beholder or Legend of Grimrock are still grid-based. Kingsfield might instead take after Ultima Underworld, in the sense that you control a sole protagonist, have completely free movement, and combat is real-time too. However, Kingsfield is its own unique blend, and it's really hard to properly express exactly what it is to someone who hasn't played it or anything tenuously similar. Even the thought of expressing the connection makes me cringe a little bit, but well, for the sake of a more relatable comparison, if you enjoyed first-person spelunking in an Elder Scrolls game, and just wanted a game that's entirely doing just that, you might be in for a treat. This doesn't really convey the tone or pacing that's integral to the series, but we'll go over that later. When I played Daggerfall Unity a couple years back, I enjoyed it immensely, and 98% of that game is navigating labyrinthine dungeons that are perhaps too big for their own good. Unfortunately, the dungeons and much of everything else in Daggerfall is procedurally generated, so they're a little thin when it comes to puzzles or any sense of logical continuity. But it fulfilled the need to spend an unholy amount of time getting lost in a dank dungeon regardless. So, what if we take those huge dungeons but instead they're entirely handcrafted, add puzzles that give them a sense of continuity and logically tie the environment together, have deliberately placed enemies and environmental hazards, and a combat system that doesn't involve making the accuracy check until the enemy finally decides to fall over. No dice rolls, nothing left to chance, no barely strung together open world, a perfectly curated, tailor-made and interconnected experience. Well, we get some damn good video games, that's what. The first Kingsfield was a Japanese exclusive launch title for the PlayStation 1. You may have seen this game already because a screenshot of it accompanies the infamous "The PlayStation can produce mind-boggling effects" caption from Electronic Gaming Monthly, which I'm sure you've had a good chuckle at. However, the game represents something of a technical achievement when we look at the wider context of its release. From Software had developed the first fully 3D action RPG for a console. Hell, as far as I'm aware, 3D action games on PC during this time were usually using 2D sprites for enemy entities and various other clutter. And notably, Doom 2, System Shock and The Elder Scrolls Arena were released earlier during the same year. We laugh at this funny little caption now, but this game was and still is pretty impressive. And they would do it again just 7 months later with Kingsfield 2, a game that's even larger in scope. The instant I opened up Kingsfield, I was absolutely hooked. Something about this 30-year-old, crusty-looking PlayStation 1 game spoke directly to my soul. A light bulb went off and I realised this is exactly what I'd been looking for. It had enraptured me and I still can't stop thinking about it. But before we examine each game, I'm going to make it clear that I'm not going to talk a great deal about the plots of any of these games nor guide you through how to progress through them. I don't think a verbatim retelling makes for an interesting review or analysis. Instead, I'm going to purely focus on the aspects I felt stood out and how these games stand out from each other, and as a series. In general, I don't feel people are as attentive as they could be when highlighting and discussing game mechanics, even when they're talking about them for hours on end. So you're not going to get a retelling of the series here that you can listen to in lieu of, actually playing them. Hey, I know you're out there. I am imploring you to play these games and appreciate them yourself. Kingsfield 1 is a little different than its sequels in the sense that it's more level-based rather than situated within a single, large, interconnected world. You can freely traverse between these levels as you progress, but there's totally a greater sense of linear progression. The kind of things you'd come to expect in a dungeon crawler are all here. Secret doors, traps, environmental hazards, treasure chests, and plenty of enemies who are never too happy to see you. You've also got NPCs that may offer hints and side quests, and the occasional figurative square peg MacGuffin that's for the specific square hole somewhere. You'll have a number of moments where you come across a chest that you can't open until you finally find the key hours later, and your eyes will light up while you exclaim, "Oh!" before you excitedly make your way back to it and try to remember where the hell it was exactly. Yeah, you're going to do a fair bit of backtracking in this game, and the sequels double down on it, though they will soften it up for you in their own ways. In Kingsfield 1, you'll be backtracking your way to the first floor just to access the healing fountain and the couple vendors down there. But at least the routes to them are fairly direct and lacking in obstructions. Speaking of vendors, they'll also offer you different prices for various goods, whether you're buying or selling, so you'll be travelling a bit more just to make sure you're getting a good deal. You may not like this constant going back and forth, but I feel the gradual familiarity with your surroundings is really important to the feel of these games. It often gives you a chance to notice things you may have missed and take notes, physical or mental, of items of interest that are currently inaccessible. Even before finding a key and traversing the space back to these areas you picked out, you're given a sense of anticipation. You're given time to think about the possibilities. It's exciting. Sometimes what you open up ends up being a bit underwhelming, but it can also put a real smile on your face. Sprinkling these unknowns is also important for establishing the threads the player can pull at to begin making sense of the game world. This is definitely not something unique to Kingsfield, but it exhibits it very strongly. To ease with all this backtracking, Kingsfield also limits which enemies respawn, so your exploration has a sense of permanence with a twofold incentive to clear out rooms. While having less monsters to avoid when making repeat trips is convenient, the way you level up attributes in this game is that you gain experience by doing. You'll get more physically strong the more you use your sword, but you'll get better at magic the more you cast that instead. A bit like an Elder Scrolls game, but you have way less attributes. Some enemies also have fixed drops rather than it being left up to chance, so it's often worth killing everything just to see if it drops anything useful. Even if it's not an item, the extra gold goes a long way. Plenty of enemies do respawn, but these tend to be in locations the player won't be running directly through often. And there's not really an incentive to farm for experience in these games unless you're somehow cutting it short to use sword magic. But I never once found myself grinding on enemies personally. I was always ahead of the curve. I think FromSoft might have been able to more tightly tune the leveling curve in these games in general, since leveling is more straightforward and you're not given any kind of stat allocation to begin with. There's no opportunity to lock yourself out of a piece of equipment because you didn't allocate your stats correctly. Nothing requires a minimum level to equip, and the only thing that requires a minimum threshold is casting sword magic. This means that RPG mechanics across this series are rather light. There's no real character building or deliberation over what you shouldn't and should be using. You typically just use the best pieces of equipment you pick up. Okay, I've mentioned sword magic twice now, but I haven't explained what it is. There are a number of swords in this game and across the series that can cast spells when performing certain button inputs. It's a pretty cool feature for sure, but you probably won't figure out how to do it, or even be aware that it exists, unless you're told or hear someone mention it online, because it's never detailed in any manuals. Despite being a core feature across all these games, it's a bit of a hidden bonus that adds a certain mystique. There are just several swords in the first Kingsfield that are capable of casting sword magic. The most notable example being the series' trademark weapon, the Moonlight Sword. Anyway, in keeping with the spirit of Kingsfield, I need to backtrack to what I was talking about. It's somewhere around here. Ah, right. Not only will you spend a good chunk of your time backtracking, you're also going to spend a fair bit of your time getting sidetracked and lost. But if you're playing this kind of game, I'm assuming that's what you're here for in the first place. Kingsfield 3 is the only one that features anything resembling an auto-map feature. The rest instead have maps presented to you as if they were created by someone within the game's world itself, and as such are often incomplete and missing details. It's honestly a pretty immersive touch, and I ended up liking this approach since the maps in Kingsfield 1 and 2 still help with general navigation, while making sure you still feel like you have plenty left to discover on your own. The map's dual function here is that it's also really useful for looking out for locations you haven't checked out yet, so that you never truly feel directionless. It can be really easy to miss a corridor or two while you're fixated on a direction, but checking the map and retracing your steps usually ends up reminding you about somewhere you've yet to go. While the first Kingsfield is a relatively simple, more linear offering compared to its sequels, it's fascinating to see how competent FromSoft were on their first outing. Just to remind you, this was their first published game, and this more linear approach would be what would offshoot into Shadow Tower, while Kingsfield goes towards a more open-ended design direction. It's got some little quirks, like how hidden doors have no collision, so enemies are constantly walking through them and revealing them to the player. But it doesn't really hurt the experience. In the sequels, you'll often hear enemies behind walls instead, which will immediately tell you that there's some sort of hidden access point in the general vicinity. Of course, many of them have no enemies behind them at all and immediately lead to treasure instead. But you'll eventually gain something of a hidden door sense and find such doors to be telegraphed whenever you enter a room. Like, if I see two chests next to each other with a gap in between them, I'm totally going to check the wall too. The first game is also a bit on the easy side too, but it helps ease you into the control scheme of these games because... Oh right, the controls. Well, even Kingsfield 3 predates the DualShock by more than a year, so instead the L and R1 buttons are used to strafe while the L and R2 buttons are used to look up and down respectively. Combat actions are entirely performed with the face buttons, while forwards and back movements and rotations are done with the D-pad. Funnily enough, the control scheme is also very similar to the PS1 Armored Core trilogy, and if you've played those games, well, Kingsfield will fit like a glove. Otherwise, you might find these controls to be a little weird at first, but you'll find you're offered a lot of control once you're accustomed to it. Despite having no analog sticks to play with, From Software were able to figure out a control scheme that allows the player to move, turn, strafe in a direction and pivot the camera up and down all at the same time, while still having complete access to their combat functions, and Kingsfield is slow-paced enough that it doesn't get overwhelming. Of course, if you're playing on an emulator, it wouldn't be a bad idea to remap the D-pad to the left stick instead. Right, more backtracking. Even talking about these games is like playing them. Kingsfield 1 is the shortest of the bunch, but this doesn't detract from it. I feel it's also a very focused game that concisely accomplishes what it sets out to do. You can probably comfortably beat it in around a couple evenings, and it's a fulfilling experience. A little clumsy and unrefined compared to its sequels for sure, but it's a great foundation and a glimmer of a really good idea. The whole game is also set in a really big crypt. The entirety of Kingsfield 1 takes place in the Royal Cemetery, and yeah, you'll be seeing a lot of gravestones and navigating a lot of samey looking corridors. Each floor at least has its own tile set to set them apart from each other, so it's not like you're looking at exactly the same floors and walls throughout your journey. And there's just enough variety. There's only 5 floors, and while they're really large, the enemy variety kind of evaporates by the time you hit the 4th one. The 4th floor also feels a little copy-pasty. The 5th floor is the shortest of the bunch and initially feels like an assault to the senses in the way the enemies start blasting projectiles at you. The 5th floor is also the only point where you'll be expected to explore previous floors outside of any keys you've collected. This isn't a point against it, but it rather highlights how much more linear this game is. The floors feel more like self-contained levels rather than having any relationship to each other. It's just a different feel compared to its sequels, and why I feel it's sometimes a little unfair to directly compare this first entry to them. The climax is also a total power trip. But this aspect becomes a trend throughout the series, and you always feel really powerful at the end of these games. While it's kinda unfortunate to have the difficulty fall off a cliff at the end, there's a certain feeling of heroic triumph that comes with it. It's your reward for slugging it out all this time. You get to end your quest with bombastic exultation, finishing the game in a flashy spectacle between the forces of good and evil that you physically get to play rather than it being relegated to a cutscene. These games tend to be really thin on bosses and they're never particularly hard, but they serve as suitable bookends to the various arcs to your quest. Though a lot of the time these bosses feel like resource checks, and will give you a good reason to start chugging the more valuable consumables you've been undoubtedly holding on to. So while the boss fights aren't a focus of this series, I find myself preferring it that way. Kingsfield 1 also features this rotating fountain. It's pretty cool. Alright, so now that you've seen a Kingsfield game in motion, this should hopefully provide more context to discuss the design principles behind these games. Kingsfield is a series of slow-paced, oppressively atmospheric dungeon crawlers with a strong focus on exploration and getting intimately familiar with the environment. Areas are typically densely packed and will coherently flow into larger zones that inform the overall world design. Even though I don't feel these games are particularly difficult, you can never shake off the feeling of imminent danger lurking behind every corner. Playing any of these games for the first time, you'll probably immediately notice how sluggish you feel, especially when it comes to turning around. And while this might feel arbitrary, it does immense work to inform the atmosphere and weight of these games. It is a deliberate design consideration that persists throughout the entire series, and it plays to the strengths of the unique approach to combat. The slow turn speed isn't entirely down to an engine limitation. Mouse injection for emulators does exist, and while using it doesn't break the operations of these games, it certainly breaks the balance. Having some limitations to the player control is really important if you want to make the player feel vulnerable. It's why old horror games work as well as they do too. And while Kingsfield can't really be considered much of a horror game, the limitations on player control give off the same feeling of vulnerability. This speed informs every facet of the design behind these games. How enemies are distributed and how they engage with the player, how environmental hazards and traps feel immensely more dangerous, how much more careful you'll be positioning yourself around enemies and obstacles, how a skeleton jumping out of a chest is initially pretty funny until it smacks you and you realise you're stuck in a room with it. It's making the player feel cautious that I feel is the core to Kingsfield. It's the integral tenet. Even when these games' difficulty curves veer off towards the easy end at certain points, you still feel inclined to respect it. A game like Kingsfield can only really exist within the vacuum of very particular design sensibilities, so it isn't much of a surprise that it hasn't really been largely replicated or explored adequately since, because the industry and audience at large will just see something like this and dismiss it as clunky, outdated, and whatever else. It's kinda sad, really. Despite the warranted push to prop up video games as an artistic medium, the audience seems all too happy to dismiss old games that don't align with modern-day sensibilities. Even when they're mechanically competent and internally cohesive, they're often brushed aside and turned into a cute little footnote, rather than something that can be fairly examined and deserving of respect. If your opinion on a game can only be summed up as calling it clunky, janky, or dated with no nuance behind the statements, you're really just laying down your own biases on the table. Recently, there has been a surge of interest towards these games and the toying around of the idea of a Kingsfield-like. But well, if you diverge too much from what Kingsfield is, we get something else entirely, and just a different brand of first-person action RPG. And that's fine. I love all kinds of games, but the ones that stick with me usually don't market themselves as well. Remember this thing? While only exhibiting the superficial elements or worse, stuffing them with pastiche, ham-fisted references. Now, Kingsfield itself is a first-person action RPG, but it would be wrong to say any first-person action RPG is like Kingsfield. I'm not trying to elevate Kingsfield above all else here, but I'd say I'm generally apprehensive about saying one game is like another, since it inevitably leads to incorrect assumptions about how a game plays and presents itself. Is Morrowind like Kingsfield? No. Don't be ridiculous. It's a bit of a quandary many indie devs end up unwittingly pigeonholing themselves into. Just let the audience make those comparisons themselves rather than invite it. You can still have a great game without latching onto the coattails of something else and the weight of assumption that comes with it. And surely this train of thought should be empowering. Though, video games are kinda shit when it comes to genre separation to begin with. We use a relatively meagre collection of words to blanket games that don't really have that many similarities at all, so the terminology becomes diluted, vague, increasingly non-descriptive. However, I'm going to stress here that genres are not there to restrict creativity. Rather, they're there to manage audience expectations. What value does a term have if it becomes so vague it doesn't describe anything at all? The idea of insert title likes are a particularly egregious example of this, with the boundaries of whatever something purports to be like constantly being eroded. Roguelikes mutated into the roguelite, though the terms seem interchangeable nowadays, and represent the nadir of this unfortunate development. A bastardized descriptor that in 2023 tells you absolutely nothing about what you're looking at. Yet will be the first and primary thing you'll be blithely told that the game is. Almost none of these games are even remotely like Rogue, yet the misnomer has stuck. Never mind the examples that feature meta progression systems, the kind of thing that allows for persistence between runs, and the antithesis of what made Rogue what it was in the first place. It becomes puzzling to me why anyone would be thrilled by the idea of a something like, when the end result can be so mechanically far removed that it would be better off calling itself something else entirely, and would really be better off for it. You can look at music genres instead and, well, new stuff is popping up all the time. There's still plenty of room for expression despite these narrower classifications, while still having the capacity to overlap, and be more than one thing at a time, sometimes creating new subgenres in themselves. One may argue that there are too many subgenres here, but I think it's more liberating for the artist and consumer alike. This whole discussion about what defines a roguelike in the current day has been done to death already, but I rarely see someone asking why anyone should be so adamant about calling a game such a thing in the first place. Ultimately, the like suffix has frankly become a lazy, catch-all term to say a game borrows one or more elements, though maybe even saying one is a stretch sometimes. But some elements from a game, and it doesn't even need to be the defining characteristics from it. Huh? Just what the fuck happened here? Somehow, this spread of diluted communication has become the modus operandi of video game discourse. Just as an aside, I remember a Steam Shmup Fest sale recently and the front page was dominated by a glut of action roguelikes and arena shooters that, at a glance, look like conventional top-down multi-directional shooters. They've been getting pretty popular lately and they're really their own thing, but they've been co-opting shmup partly because of a questionable overlap with bullet hell. I can't recall if many conventional shmups had much visibility at all, really. You had to dig a bit deep. Makes you wonder that if Asteroid was released today but with an upgrade shop, would people be calling it an action roguelike too? Though, honestly, I'm well aware that trying to express my sentiments here is an exercise in futility. Just like how the Berlin interpretation of roguelike was ultimately left to the wayside and now, Souls-like can just get slapped onto seemingly any action game nowadays. And when you talk to some of these people, you'd think a dodge roll with iframes didn't exist before 2009. Anyway, the industry and audience has moved on for better or worse, and I doubt even modern FromSoft would be willing or even able to design a theoretical Kingsfield 5 that preserves the essence of these games. Especially not one that would be a critical darling. They would just be better off making something else with a different name entirely, and that would be perfectly fine. Essentially, I guess what I'm getting at here is that it'd be like saying I'm going to make a 2D platformer that's like Sonic, and then not have any sort of momentum-based physics and platforming. Have you really been inspired by what those games offer at that point, or are you just making your own thing? Either outcome is fine, but surely it's better to not say anything at all, lest you misdirect people into thinking your game is something it isn't, or give people who aren't familiar with those games the wrong impression about what they're about and, at worst, soil the conversation surrounding those games entirely. You already see this when a sequel to an established property diverges too much from its predecessors and old and new fans start butting heads. It may even serve to undermine what's unique about your game in the first place. I'd rather, well, avoid a scenario where any first-person action RPG can just call itself like Kingsfield, because the language surrounding these games becomes so degraded. I think I've been driving my stats here long enough, but I've become a deeply passionate person about this collection of games, and it's given me a lot to think about. But I especially feel that anything that would call itself like these games will be walking a very delicate balance. It's a very specific kind of experience, and I do genuinely feel it's possible to create something new without just making a cheap carbon copy, but it's going to require a great deal of attentiveness. However, I am being a bit hard on some devs here, despite me just saying that the audience should be left to make these comparisons. We also seem unwilling to expand our vocabulary to properly accommodate new expressions. Hell, even old ideas can get lost under the tide of this diluted discourse. Do video games have a kind of a, literacy problem? That question is unfortunately outside the scope of a, what was I doing again? Oh right, yeah, a Kingsfield analysis. So, let's move on. Combat in Kingsfield looks rather simple, but it's not without intent. See the two bars up there? We've got one for melee attacks and one for magic attacks. Unlike a more conventional, modern stamina system you may be more familiar with, whenever you attack, the respective bar completely depletes and will take some time to charge up. The power of your melee attack scales relative to how full the bar is, while magic attacks can only be cast while the bar is full. More conventionally, magic also costs MP to cast, so it's not like you can fire off an unlimited supply of projectiles. The time it takes to charge up depends on various factors, so some weapons and spells will either make the bar charge up faster or slower. Some swords are also capable of casting magic and utilise both bars in order to cast it. Whenever you hit an opponent with a full power melee swing or magic attack, they'll typically stagger, cancelling their attack animation and allowing you to safely get out of the way. What makes this approach interesting is that you're immediately discouraged from spamming attacks, and the environment will also often restrict how you're able to engage. You're often forced to carefully take your engagements head on rather than attempting to circle strafe behind everything, which immediately makes everything you encounter more threatening. And rooms with multiple enemies or environmental hazards further demand a greater degree of situational awareness. Despite being able to equip shields, there's no ability to block incoming attacks in these games, so you really have to check your distance. There's a bit of nuance here because you ideally want to sit just outside the enemy's attack range, baiting an attack if necessary, and then moving in during the apex of your own swing so you connect with the enemy. And I specifically say the apex of your swing here because you don't hit stuff by just aiming a crosshair in Kingsfield. In fact, there is no crosshair. Rather, weapons have hitboxes relative to their size and the way you physically swing them. A weapon with a wide arc can hit stuff towards your sides, while something that swings vertically can have an easier time hitting enemies above or below you. This also makes weapon length a fairly important attribute to take note of, since you can almost see it as the weapon's inherent risk value. Shorter weapons are going to require you to get closer and spend more time being exposed, but they'll also typically charge up faster. It's a genuinely different feeling to just lining up stuff to a crosshair and gives you a greater sense of a physical presence in the world. What I'm getting at here is that the combat in Kingsfield demands a certain mastery and understanding of properly utilising 3D space. You feel like a real, three-dimensional entity occupying the world rather than simply guiding a camera and whatever floating weapon around. Gameplay footage on its own cannot properly convey this, and the closest you'll get are a number of third-person action RPGs, in which animation priority is a core part of the game feel. By alternating sword and magic attacks, it also becomes possible to chain staggers on enemies, which gives you a reason to use weaker spells since these typically have much faster charge-up times compared to something more powerful. It's all super simple on the surface, but feels surprisingly involved and really immersive once you get into the groove of things. Each game also makes some slight alterations to the combat, that I'll highlight when I talk about those games specifically, but the core of it stays the same throughout. And it's good that fighting in these games doesn't suck, because that's the primary thing you'll be doing while you navigate the expansive environments these games offer. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but I need to say it again. Kingsfield 2 was released a mere 7 months after Kingsfield 1. Old game production cycles were lightning fast, but the difference in scope achieved here is simply immense. Going from the more level-based floor structure of Kingsfield 1, the second entry now features a seamless, interconnected world with no loading screens. I'll say that again, there's no loading screens. It's worthy of respect. So committed were From Software to realising a fully 3D world that even the trees are three-dimensional. It's phenomenal. While Kingsfield 1 laid down the mechanical foundation of the series, 2 refines it and becomes a mighty, towering achievement. It's this title that really represents the gold standard that this series is held up to. Also, Kingsfield 2 was simply released as Kingsfield in the West since the first game never made it outside of Japan. However, I'll be referring to this game and its sequels with their Japanese numbering. After a short introductory cutscene, we're chucked onto the shore of the island of Melanat. We're outside and we're treated to some beautiful 1995 PS1 water. And oh boy, is this starting area just jam-packed with various exercises that teach the player some of the new mechanics. You might be inclined to take a dip and immediately find out that no, you can't swim. Starting from this title, we can sprint now. By holding the interact button down, we completely deplete our power bars and can run around indefinitely. When we release the button, we stop sprinting and there's a bit of a delay before the bars fill up again. And the rate depends on whichever weapon and spell you have equipped. You also don't need to wait for the bars to fill up to begin sprinting again. A sprint system sounds mundane, but the way it's introduced here and interacts with the rest of the game's systems is nothing short of genius. Sprinting in Kingsfield primarily serves as a backtracking tool. Since your power bars are entirely depleted, you're left completely vulnerable since there's no way to immediately retaliate. Combined with the player's slow turn speed, it's also just genuinely unhelpful to sprint around locales you're unfamiliar with, since you'll likely just sprint into walls and have to slowly turn around anyway. So, FromSoft realised they created a really big map the player was going to have to travel back and forth a lot within, and the solution here is, well, it's goddamn perfect is what it is. You can run around quickly in areas you've already cleared out, which is further facilitated by enemies not respawning everywhere and getting in the way, but it's not particularly helpful to do it while exploring a new area, so you're still encouraged to take your time. And this keen awareness to preserve the slow-paced initial crawl when you enter somewhere new must have been intentional, because it's completely preserved in the sequels. God, it's just so fucking good. However, it also gives them the space to design areas around sprinting and providing the player with a sense of urgency to get from point A to B, making it especially more tense since you'll be left vulnerable against whatever you're trying to avoid. And the funny thing is because of Kingsfield's unique approach, or rather a lack of a stamina system, it doesn't fall into the same annoying pitfalls a more modern action game falls into, in which you're constantly holding down and then releasing the sprint button and then holding it down again, with your eyes darting between the stamina bar and the rest of the game. There are a number of sections within the starting area where the player is encouraged to use the sprint function to navigate around certain hazards. There's a narrow walkway towards a lighthouse in which you'll be accosted by man-eating fish, though you can instead try sprinting over this small gap if you're feeling adventurous. You can even do it on the way back if you missed it the first time. There's a snail at the end of a tunnel that will shoot projectile breath at you, that you'll want to rush towards, and it teaches the player that sprinting towards an enemy might be a good idea. The lighthouse housing a fire gem shows the player how they'll acquire new spells this time, and it introduces verticality to the player and fall damage, if they're not careful. Taking a tumble in this game really hurts, so it's just as well that they're showing you the limits this early on. But if the player wasn't particularly clumsy, they may feel inclined to test out if they can sprint across a gap towards a chest, located near the save point in this zone. You can't make it, but if you fall you'll take some meager fall damage, and it's enough to teach the player to be careful around inclines. There's a spot where you need to be aware of this added verticality, and you'll have to drop down in order to finish up the area. There are many other places in this game where you'll need to descend from a ledge to access certain areas too. The added verticality adds just a little more depth to the navigation, and having to make a jump will always make you wince just a little bit even if you know it's safe. You really feel that impact. Not only that, making the player drop down in this fashion forces them to make a commitment and brave the unknown. It's a good way to add some tension. Upon finding that save point I briefly mentioned, you'll also notice a pedestal next to it, and you'll find a gate item off a corpse nearby, which may hint to the player that there may be a way to teleport around this game. And sure enough, you'll be able to once you find the respective key. Players can assign any save point as a teleport location in this game by inserting a key into a pedestal, and after you pick up a couple, it becomes practical to shift them around depending on where your current expedition is taking place. It's another tool that eases up on the backtracking in this game. There's a large squid-looking enemy on the shore guarding the entrance to a cave, and it teaches the player that sometimes it's better to avoid a fight and make a note to come back later, when you're feeling better equipped. Just down from this guy is somewhere inaccessible that needs a specific kind of key to access, and it's something else the player will need to keep in the back of their mind. It's the beginnings of those important threads that the player uses to stitch their understanding of the game world together. We also see the familiar fountain, though the way you interact with it this time is a little different. There are multiple of them now, and you'll be able to find and craft crystal flasks, which you can use to bottle up the water and, depending on the colour of the juice, can be used to restore HP, MP, status effects, or all three. If you've played a Souls game, then these won't feel dissimilar to using Estus flasks, though you'll have to make a trip back to the fountain every time you want to fill your bottles up, rather than it being restocked at save points. Conveniently, there's a way better fountain right next to a save point that you can set as a teleport location, and will functionally become your home point. You also need to interact with hidden doors in order to open them now, rather than just phasing through them. And while you're not taught to use it in this zone, or well, anywhere in game really, there's a new quick select slot in the equipment menu, where you can stick a consumable, a spell, or a key item to cut down on menu navigation slightly. Right, so this little starting area is just a really cool introductory zone, and if you do screw up and learn let's say a valuable lesson, it's at least early enough to not feel hugely inconvenient. And coming back here to deal with the giant squid and hidden passage later on, gives the player some nice perspective on how much stronger they've gotten too. This starting zone is really good, it's great, it's peak game design. Kingsfield 2 also features way more NPCs than its forebear, that will either have their own side quests or tell you more about the island. Melanat is essentially a mining colony, with many of the NPCs trying to make ends meet gathering the crystals the island is known for. Their impact on the narrative is widely inconsequential besides the few that will help you directly or outright give you the tools to progress through the game, but having more context while you explore the island does add more weight to your actions. They introduce ranged weapons with a bow and arbalest in this game, but don't expect to be using them a great deal. Arrows are hard to come by, and you may find it hard to justify making more of them since they use the same large crystals you need to make crystal flasks. Maybe it would have been a good idea to have an option to craft them out of the fairly useless crystal shards you pick up instead. But well, limiting arrows also feeds into limiting enemy respawns. You feel less like you're pissing away a consumable if the enemy you're shooting at isn't going to come back. So while it may be disappointing to some that you won't be able to play as some sort of archer, the intent makes more sense within the context of the game's design. You will, however, run into plenty of enemy archers while playing Kingsfield 2. And I guess the neat thing about fighting these guys is that they skillfully lead their shots and will almost always hit you if you just simply run in a straight line. So it's possible to make them miss you if you properly weave left and right. It really feeds back into the idea of how the combat in these games demands a solid understanding of 3D space. If there's one thing that just gets somewhat aggravating about Kingsfield 2, however, it's these rhombus keys. These keys are numerous and open many doors, but you can slot them in and out and reuse them indefinitely. You'll spend a great deal of time inserting rhombus keys, checking what's behind the door, and then taking out the key to use it somewhere else. You may even find it necessary to methodically pluck out every key from a given area, which is way less convenient than it sounds, since many of these doors require a key from the side you're opening them from. Essentially, most doors require 2 keys to be fully functional. It can get a little tedious, and they unfortunately carry over the idea into Kingsfield 3, though to a much lesser degree. I'm pretty sure there's enough rhombus keys to open up every door that needs them, but if you happen to chance upon a series of doors, and you aren't holding enough, you'll likely feel inclined to take a hike back to wherever you can take what you can, only to find that you might want to put them back later. There's an NPC that can duplicate keys, but it's a rather pricey endeavour. If these were instead designed for a single area, it would make for a good puzzle, but you kinda find these doors everywhere. Despite that little snag, exploring and unravelling the secrets of the island is a really engrossing experience, and there was always at least one thread in the back of my mind that kept me thinking, oh, I should go check out that place now, whenever I hit a bit of a dead end. I never really felt directionless while playing, which speaks volumes to how tightly designed this entry is despite its relative openness. I don't know if I can say the same for Kingsfield 3. Actually, before we look at Kingsfield 3, let's briefly look at pilot style. A demo for Kingsfield 3 that was handed out during the very first Tokyo Game Show. Curiously, it was released 2 months after Kingsfield 3 itself. Despite being a demo for Kingsfield 3, it actually serves as a prequel, and you control a completely different protagonist. It only takes less than an hour to see everything it has to offer, but it's a neat little taster regardless. Not much to elaborate on though. I guess the thing that will mostly stick out is how much the graphical quality is bumped up, and that the caves look way more cavey, and that you're actually in a field for once. Yeah, there's a massive graphical jump. Jeez, look at this gorgeous toadstool. Oh, it's fucking aggressive, okay. Wasn't expecting that. Looks like they've had to scrap the 3D foliage though, so you can look forward to 2D billboard trees. So without further ado, it's time for Kingsfield 3. After our introductory sequence, we're dropped into Verdite, the same region as Kingsfield 1, but this time, we're outside. In a field. If you didn't think Kingsfield 2 was open enough, then 3 has you covered, because it's very open. To a fault, even. Kingsfield 3 is a little hard to write about since I don't feel too strongly about it, nor feel like it really expands much mechanically from Kingsfield 2. It refines some things, but for better or worse. The scope of this game is larger than what I think a Kingsfield game can reasonably realise, and we go from tightly knit dungeons to a full-blown kingdom that our man must still traverse on 2 feet. I feel the opening of this game is way weaker than its predecessor too. And perhaps during development there was an assumption the player would be coming into this game from 2. It's the last game of a trilogy after all. This might be a harder entry to initially pick up and get into if you're unfamiliar with the series' design language. The outside environments are initially a total breath of fresh air to anyone who already spent the time playing Kingsfield 1 and 2. I just think the particularly open areas maybe should have been done more sparingly. And it's not only that. The maps in Kingsfield 3 are about as wide as an ocean, but have the depth of a puddle. Gone is any sense of verticality and the crisscrossing of the environment weaving above and below itself. The wells in this game may initially tempt you into thinking there may be a hidden waterlogged environment below your feet. But no, you'll simply die once you hit the bottom. Unfortunately, there's nothing to discover down there. What you see in front of you while traversing Kingsfield 3 is what you get. A great deal of your time is spent outside running around these wide, open environments that don't always have a great deal interesting going on in them. I can appreciate the sort of epic scale From is going for with this one, but the game's still at its best when you're navigating around densely packed dungeons, that this game still thankfully provides. But a lot of your time will be spent aimlessly trudging around open-air environments populated by a myriad of unfriendly denizens. And for whatever reason, the local population is perfectly accustomed to having highly aggressive plant life occupying their villages. But this may just be a cultural difference I'm unacquainted with. This change in approach isn't unwelcome and it does provide more variety for the player, but I find this game to be the most decisive, because if you catch the wrong end of the stick, it's easy to be left on very long, directionless excursions trying to find a thread that takes you somewhere. I find that there's less of a sense of the pieces falling into place. When the places you can go are several large, very open fields, you start to wonder how many rocks you need to turn over before you catch a lead. The kind of leads you're looking for aren't actually that obscure, but sometimes you may find yourself going on an ill-informed wild goose chase, or down paths that are a little more obtuse than expected. Backtracking for the sake of progression is one thing, but aimlessly wandering around all over the place trying to find a lead to begin with can get a little wearisome. For me, it was this asshole right here. I cannot allow anyone to pass unless he is endowed with the magical power of wind. Oh, right, context. Part of the main plot thread of this game is that you need to find the sages of fire, wind, water, and earth in order to unseal the Moonlight Sword. Bumping into the fire sage early on taught me Fireball, so clearly the natural reaction to this man's gatekeeping would be to locate the wind sage, and learn a wind spell, probably Wind Cutter. I guess the temple back there has some wind-centric interactions or puzzles. Little did I know that the Wind Sage is actually located within the Wind Temple itself. So what our friend here is really after is for me to gain a digit in this funny little number here, where my elemental attributes are listed. In Kingsfield 3, casting specific elemental spells increases the respective elemental attribute, which means the only way to level up your wind magic level without knowing any spells is to chance upon a wind crystal or verdite gem to level up your magic attributes. It's a easy misunderstanding. What ensues is an hours-long pursuit for something that was never in reach to begin with. Oh, I gained those wind magic levels alright, and then some, but it wasn't until I had completely exhausted what options were available that I found myself giving him another visit, and was allowed in after that protracted misunderstanding. The hilarious part is that I did chance upon a wind crystal not even 5 minutes after talking to this guy the first time, and I wonder how differently my adventure would have unfolded if I made the connection sooner. Well, after that it was mostly smooth sailing, but there are still a couple other points where I feel it's easy to lose track of the threads. The NPCs are just a little more involved this time, and at one point you have to talk to a soldier to build a bridge over a river of lava. But he was already involved with a side quest you likely completed early on, so it may not occur to you to speak to him specifically until you simply make the rounds. Like, there's nothing about this guy that makes him come across as a particularly helpful individual either. There's also the entire Lake Noel segment, where it feels like the developer is egging you on to do a little save scumming. There are a bunch of little islands across this lake, but only a fraction of them are accessible at a time, via water bridges that can only be manipulated via accessing a room after giving an NPC an item she requests. The catch is that she gets a little more demanding every time you want to access this room. The water sage is located at the end of one of these paths, and you unlock free access to manipulate those bridges once you do find them. It's hard to disparage this section too much because of the proximity of the save point, but it's right next to the NPC. It's like an acknowledgement that this section is somewhat questionably designed. It's kind of obvious the water sage should be here, but still. That's just a few examples. It's the kind of game I'd probably have more fun playing a second time knowing how things are connected. What probably doesn't help either is the difference in map mechanics too. Kingsfield 3 instead features something more akin to an automap, rather than how you find semi-completed maps in 1 and 2. I feel like you could have no map at all and it would functionally serve the same purpose in many of these zones. And the teleport points have been reworked into fixed ones rather than ones you can set yourself. There are gold and blue fountains dotted around the zones, and after collecting specific items the player may teleport to the gold ones. I don't think removing player agency to set these yourself was particularly helpful, and it often leads to even more backtracking than necessary, since the way the gold fountains are distributed isn't particularly great. The most egregious example here is accessing the vendor at the start of the game if you just want reasonably priced herbs. So you have to make the same long trek through several zones every single time. I think it somewhat cheapens the scale this game is trying to convey. There's also a lot of NPCs to chat to in this game too, and man do some of them have a lot to say. Maybe it's just the localization, but the NPCs this time around have a lot more personality to them. And the Truth Mirror in particular often provides some humorous insight, considering the absolutely miserable state of the kingdom you're trying your hardest to save is in. Some of the almost unhinged stuff the NPCs come out with helps lighten the mood just a bit, and somehow makes their position more relatable. It manages to entertain without crossing into tonal whiplash. Oh, and here's a feature I wish FromSoft had included in their more recent titles, a dialogue log with every NPC you've interacted with. This is a really nice feature that I admittedly neglected to utilize much over my playthrough, but I appreciate being there all the same. There's also these kinda fascinating cutscenes. They're about as seamless as you can get here, but it's super interesting. Seeing this kind of experimentation with what feels like an in-engine cutscene. Like, they're clearly pre-rendered video, but there's an attempt to make them look otherwise. It's just kinda cool seeing these almost seamless transitions between gameplay to cutscene and back again in such an old game. Kingsfield 3 makes the weapon weight and length characteristics visible to the player. Or rather, I'm framing it this way since the things they influence have always been part of these games. But you weren't able to make decisions around them since you wouldn't know until you used the weapon. Weapon length is obvious enough, while weight influences the recharge speed. Enemies exhibit higher stagger thresholds in this game, and for a while I thought the weight characteristic was what influenced this, but I'm pretty sure it's just straight up dealing enough damage. When I picked up the Triple Fang, which is a very lightweight weapon that does immense damage, I was staggering everything I hit with ease. Also, you're given a sword in this game that you're expected to level up, the Excelsator, but the way this levels up has to do with gaining enough XP in general rather than actively using it. The sword will level up regardless if you use it or not. It always seemed to lag behind the options I picked up along the way, and I never ended up using it much. I guess it does have sword magic going for it at least. Though, learning sword magic in this game is also more obtuse, requiring you to complete a couple side quest chains, and then speaking to a specific NPC once you're at an adequate level across all your spell attributes. I don't know if all these extra steps were truly necessary, and the high requirements really just lock away sword magic until the very end of the game. Despite my misgivings, I still feel Kingsfield 3 is a fitting end to the Verdite trilogy. While I didn't find it as interesting to navigate as 2, I think its openness at least makes it feel like a unique entry in its own right. And it ended about as bombastically as I hoped. The castle areas at the end have a weighty sense of finality to them that truly make you feel like a hero storming the gate. And I was grinning the whole time during the climax with the king, since it largely came down to launching unrelenting streams of sword magic at each other, until one of us, not me because the end of these games is easy, keeled over. There's even an extra boss after him if you fulfill some specific conditions with a true ending to boot. Oh, and it was really cool bumping into the Royal Cemetery from Kingsfield 1 near the entrance to Verdite Castle too. It's in a heavily truncated state, and only partially includes the first floor and even less of the fifth. But going in there and immediately checking what was and wasn't in there was a bit of a rush. I was smiling like an idiot the whole time, especially when the secret doors were in the same spots. It's funny because this zone's inclusion would have completely went over the heads of Western gamers, who never had the opportunity to play the first game when it was initially released. After Kingsfield 3 and the conclusion to the Verdite trilogy, this series would take on a bit of a hiatus, until the PlayStation 2 was released and we'd see the fourth and final entry. Despite having no ties to our familiar Verdite, Kingsfield 4, or Kingsfield the Ancient City, as it was released in the West, doesn't really rock the boat, and it doesn't really expand a great deal on Kingsfield's mechanics or systems, but rather it's a refinement and a wonderfully crafted scenario with immaculate level design. I wouldn't say I like it more than Kingsfield 2, but it's remarkable in its own way. And honestly, after playing the PS1 games back-to-back off the back of playing the PS1 Armored Core games back-to-back, booting up Kingsfield 4 was like experiencing a genuine leap between console generations for the first time all over again. Sure, it's not the prettiest PS2 game out there, especially not with this blurry interlacing thing going on, but the game's art direction is pretty tight, and that jump in graphical quality allows for Kingsfield 4 to exude a potent atmosphere of its own. The game starts off with a scale that initially feels dialed back compared to its predecessors, and while the individual zones in the rest of the game do feel smaller, they also feel more dense with a meticulous and careful hand guided through them. The opening act starts above ground where a number of NPCs are hanging about, but it otherwise feels like an unwelcoming and unhospitable place to be. You don't feel welcome here. And this clusterfuck of slimes at the entrance of the mine don't make you feel welcome either. If there's one thing I don't like about this game, it's that no matter what, it never seems like you're at a safe distance to hit these guys, without inevitably getting smacked yourself and poisoned to boot. Unlike previous games, you're able to swim in Kingsfield 4. Well, saying it's swimming is deceptive. It's more like you're an anchor dragging yourself across the floor for as long as you can breathe. There's a location in this starting area where you can dip your toes to see how long you can last. You can also test the limits of fall damage in this starting area, and find out about all sorts of wonderful environmental traps. There's also this chest behind a bunch of barrels that may invite you to start trying to break them to get through, and you'll find out that you're not strong enough to break them. For now, at least. Maybe this was an attempt to teach the player about a couple features I'm a bit contentious about, and I feel were pointless inclusions, but it's weapon durability and by extension, weapon levels. What if we take the level by doing thing but make it really obnoxious and pointlessly grindy? Welcome to the weapon leveling system in Kingsfield 4. All weapons range from level 1 to 3, with level 2 requiring 180 hits, and level 3 taking a further 300 hits to achieve. This applies to ranged weapons too, which need ammo. Sounds expensive. Within the context of Kingsfield, that's a lot of swinging about, and enemies especially don't respawn much in this game, so you'll have to take advantage of specific, sometimes out of the way locations or circumstances where they do. Magic is leveled up similarly too, but it feels less grindy. The worst part is that you can't level up, say, your healing spell unless you're hurt, so you may feel inclined to take a dip in some poison. Thankfully, you don't need level 3 anything to beat the game anyway, but that's besides the point. In what feels like the only major misstep of the series, this leveling mechanic is confounded by a durability system. Durability only ranges from 100 to 50%, but regardless, the lower the durability on the weapon, the less base damage it deals. You can repair weapons, but the item required to do this is hard to come by, and is also used to perform various upgrades. It's needless upkeep. It's perplexing. The durability mechanic isn't invasive since nothing breaks, but it's impactful enough to make you rotate weapons. But if you rotate weapons, you're never going to get one to level 3. And there's an incentive to do this since every weapon this time has sword magic, but it's only accessible at level 3. Though, there are some weapons that have sword magic accessible at any level, while also having a second sword spell at level 3, but this just makes them way more desirable to use than the ones that need all that extra work. For the record, you can also level up your fist to level 3, and yeah, it has magic too. It's bizarre. The weapon durability and leveling mechanics don't sour the experience, but it's the most pointlessly tacked on addition and doesn't really add anything either. So whatever, I can get over it. The opening act feels a little linear, but soon enough you'll descend and the game opens up once you make your way into the game's titular location, the ancient city, and an eerily similar rendition to Radiohead's Paranoid Android. The ancient city itself is a massive, multi-story complex that loops in and out of itself in unexpected ways. If the interconnectedness in Dark Souls gets you going, then you gotta try this stuff too. It's fantastic. Something I noticed while fighting enemies in Kingsfield 4 is that you're usually punished for taking the initiative. If you try to attack head-on first in hopes of just staggering the enemy and dipping out, it usually doesn't work. It's a subtle change to the rhythm, since you need to be more attentive about taking advantage of enemy openings rather than making the openings yourself. This little tweak gives Kingsfield 4 a different feeling than that of the Verdite trilogy, and demands a greater level of care from the player. Speaking of care, this game feels way more stingy when it comes to money, and you won't be lugging around as many, nor as potent healing vials for a while either. The gold pool that restores everything isn't available until very late in the game. This feeds back into the more punishing style of combat because if you get too impatient, you'll quickly be pissing away all the money you spent on restoration items. It takes some adjusting to if you came into this from the PS1 trilogy, but I especially feel like the majority of my playthrough's expenditures was keeping on top of restoration items, rather than eyeing up any equipment. This game's also way more weird about how it handles maps, and I don't know how to feel about it. Kingsfield 4 features a lot more unique and easily distinguishable landmarks, so orienting yourself in general is easier, and I never felt too lost while playing it. But the maps range from genuinely useless to useful until you don't need them anymore, and then you'll get one good map when you've practically finished the game. I like that they still feel like in-universe additions, but they usually just end up being something you sell off. It's hard to get too worked up over it because there was very few times where I felt like, oh man, I really wish I had a map right now. However, your own mileage might vary depending on how directionally challenged you are. And then this lack of serviceable maps might make your experience suffer. The ancient city also reuses the teleport system from Kingsfield 2, but with a little twist. Rather than being able to teleport from anywhere, you can only teleport via a magic circle on the ground. I don't dislike the direction. Not having a get out of jail free card adds to the tension of navigating deeper into an area. Adds to the backtracking too, for sure, but when it comes to limiting enemy respawns, I feel this entry does it to an even more extreme degree. As you gradually explore and clear out this place of unwelcoming and dangerous enemies, the only thing left to grace its cold and lonely halls is yourself. You barely meet any friendly NPCs down here either. The respawning mechanics in previous games was noticeable, but in this one, it's really stark. I don't know if they went too far with it, but it certainly adds to the unique atmosphere. Also, despite the central location of this ancient city tying this all together, there's still a nice variety to the environments. Unwittingly looping back towards the ancient city and seeing that familiar architecture, and hearing the BGM roll in provides a certain level of comfort and satisfaction. It's like coming back home. And unlike Kingsfield 3, the few open-air environments this game provides are relatively small and kept brief. It really just adds to the scale of the game when you're allowed a glimpse of the outside world, after spending hours brushing your shoulders against the dungeon walls. It's a nice balance and feels like a brief reprieve before you make your re-entry. The enemy design in this title also takes a bit of an interesting turn, with these xenomorph-looking creatures prowling about. And the final area the boss occupies is totally tapping into a more unsettling alien aesthetic. There's a number of references to the dark that would probably go on to influence Dark Souls thematics. And the alien aesthetic that these creatures exhibit totally drives home the idea of them being invasive. I rather like it. It adds to the atmosphere of Kingsfield 4 in a way that sets it apart from the Verdite trilogy while not going overboard with the idea. There's also a few more bosses compared to its predecessors too, or rather bosses that aren't just upsized, reskinned versions of stuff you've been fighting already. They're a bit more fleshed out compared to before, but they're still pretty restrained at the same time. They're still never particularly difficult though, provided you're prepared. And there's not even much of a flashy finisher for the end boss this time either. Rather, the entire zone the final boss is in is the spectacle, and it's really cool. These games are always going to be more about the journey, so I'm never going to get too hung up about how the bosses are. But man, does the final area of Kingsfield 4 exude a sense of finality. But well, you've got to stick your sword in that dude sooner or later and finish it. And when the credits scroll over the screen, you're hit with a realization. That's the end. That's it. All good things must come to an end, and Kingsfield is over. It's been over 20 years and there's nothing else quite like it. And there probably never will be. So just as well we got 4 games out of it. But well, I'm afraid the game, the series, is over. Though, not really. There technically were some more Kingsfield games, such as Kingsfield Additional 1 and 2. However, these PlayStation Portable exclusive titles do away with the fully 3D action RPG style these games are known for, and resemble something more like a grid-based dungeon crawler, though still from the perspective of a single character. From what I've read and seen, a number of design elements were retained despite this, but it's fundamentally a different experience regardless. And well, since there isn't any sort of English translation patch for either game, and I'm a disgusting EOP, they're a bit out of my means. I'd love to play them though. And then there are the games you could consider directly adjacent. The Shadow Tower series and Eternal Ring. Though, while these games may share certain design elements, they're also explicitly their own thing. And I should briefly mention the mobile games too. Kingsfield Mobile, Kingsfield EX, and Kingsfield Mobile 2. Apparently, 1 and EX are essentially the same game, and are remakes of Kingsfield 1. Meanwhile, 2 is a completely different adventure and even features enemies never seen in a Kingsfield game before. These mobile games were allegedly fairly good, and were fully featured titles despite being for flip phones, and unlike Additional 1 and 2, were fully 3D, real-time, first-person action RPGs. But unfortunately, the mobile games are all lost media, and all searches to find them have run into dead ends. Maybe they'll crop up as Gmod archive titles, but it's not looking hopeful. We've also got the various Sword of Moonlight projects too. And if I ever start feeling the pangs for something familiar, I guess I know where to start looking around next. Sword of Moonlight itself is a rather fascinating subject. From Software in 2000 had essentially released a Kingsfield maker, with a license to commercially distribute anything you made with it. It sounds kinda crazy on the surface. Imagine if Nintendo did that with Mario Maker. These Sword of Moonlight projects include entirely original works, while others may expand on the lore and settings within Kingsfield. And it may be worth making another video like this, and exploring some of those projects. But sadly, as it stands, Kingsfield ends here. 4 fantastic first-person real-time dungeon crawler action RPGs that were, and in some ways still are, ahead of their time. And they all exhibit their own strengths that make them worth playing individually. If you're willing to set aside your biases and give an old dog a chance, I think you'll be in for some genuinely eye-opening and fulfilling experiences. Sometimes the rough edges just make things more interesting, just gives things a wee bit more flavour. And maybe, just maybe, at this point, we can truly appreciate that the PlayStation did produce mind-boggling effects. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching, and take care. This video was a lot of fun to make. Also, I regularly stream on YouTube, so if you ever catch me live, feel free to tune in. Special thanks to channel members Electrofunk, Aristhel, Bavi, Fino the Fox, and Dragonlord1472. As always, your support is truly appreciated.